Peter Zeihan is one of the most thought-provoking geopolitical strategists you'll ever hear. His most recent book is Disunited Nations, The Scramble for Power in an Ungoverned World, and he joins us today on Financial Sense. So, Peter, you have an excellent amount of materials at Zeihan.com. That's Zeihan. I want to encourage all of our listeners to sign up for your newsletter. Last time we had you on, which was about 3 months ago in August, you told our listeners that the fourth quarter this year is when we were likely to see a significant announcement or progress on the vaccine front, and that based on your analysis, Pfizer's was the one that you thought had the best chance. Well, lo and behold, Pfizer just made a significant announcement. Stocks are now at record all-time highs based on that. Lots of confidence and a lot of positive sentiment now surrounding this. So what are your thoughts on the recent announcement, and are you as excited as everyone else is?
Well, I wouldn't give myself too much credit for this one. I'm just drawing some lines with the information that we've gotten to this point. And when it comes to stocks, we have had a lot of cash sitting on the sidelines, just waiting for any sort of faint blip of positive news. And we had one yesterday, and so of course money flooded in. Pfizer is still the vaccine that is the front runner, so that's great. And the news that came out yesterday indicates a 90% strong reaction, which is great. However, it's only from 94 cases. So I don't want to make this sound like it's more than it is. This is still not what we would consider the level of data requirements that are necessary for this thing to go into mass production, much less be distributed nationwide. It's a positive sign. I don't want to minimize that, but it's still a problem. The bigger problem with the Pfizer vaccine is because it's a new technique, it has to be super chilled for distribution to negative 94 degrees, and it's a two-shot vaccine. So if the Pfizer one in its current form is ultimately the winner, we're not going to be able to start meaningful distribution until the third quarter of next year. And that assumes that this thing is finalized today. More likely it's going to be in December, which means that we're talking this time next year is when it'll finally start getting into circulation. One of the things you have to remember about cold storage is that, there's refrigeration, there's freezing, and then there's deep freezing. And this is ultra deep freezing. So it could not go to pharmacies. It could not go to your normal primary care physician. It could only go to hospitals and research facilities. So 85% of the places where people normally get their immunizations, the Pfizer vaccine can't play. So if this is the winning candidate, we're talking about a very long-term rollout. And you wouldn't just have to go there once, you would have to go there twice. So all the normal logistic and cost and distribution problems that we expect from this sort of vaccine, you have to go through the whole thing twice, more than 1 month apart, no more than 2 months apart.
So I think it's good to keep in mind, there's never a perfect solution in this complex world we live in. It's always a matter of trade-off. So in this case, if we do see, as the initial trials have shown, 90% effective on a small sample, as you pointed out, it's good to keep that in mind. 90% effectiveness, but it also requires a somewhat of a logistical nightmare. So the trade-off is that it's not going to be able to reach everyone as quickly. It's not going to be able to go to your local doctor. So perhaps best case scenario is we have multiple vaccines at play. This is the one that maybe this is going out first to the most vulnerable, those that are on the front lines, medical professionals, healthcare staff, etc. And then we have another one that can reach the broader population quicker.
Yeah, a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, there's no problem with having more than one vaccine. It's just that the government money that is going to be available to fast track production and distribution is probably going to be focused on whichever one comes out first. So if, for example, the Pfizer one comes out first, it'll be rushed out as quickly as possible to healthcare workers who, tend to work in hospitals, which is where, facilities that can handle this thing. So there's nothing wrong with that. And then if there's any leftover, it'll go to probably vulnerable populations. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine doesn't require the ultra cold storage and is a single shot vaccine. So it may, emphasis on the word may, prove to be the one that makes it into the general public. One thing to keep in mind about the Pfizer one and the Moderna one is that they are using fundamentally new techniques, this whole mRNA process that we've never used before for vaccines in humans. So there's going to be some teething pains. The cold storage is part of that. And this will undoubtedly revolutionize vaccines moving forward so that the next time we need something like this, it won't take nearly as long. The distribution won't be nearly as hairy. And you want to talk about something that is going to take the flu vaccine and leap it forward. These are great advancements to be had. Unfortunately, they're just not fast enough for what we want right now.
Well, one thing that I've got to say is I was pretty amazed with just even that 90% effective rate that Pfizer has said so far that they've seen, because, I mean, if we think about just the normal flu vaccine, it's basically a coin toss. I mean, it's like, it can range anywhere between as low as, 30% effectiveness to as high as maybe 60% effectiveness, I believe are the numbers. So
I think it's a little higher than that. And the reason those numbers sometimes get quoted as being so low is not because there's something wrong with the vaccine or its effectiveness, but the cocktail of viruses that are part and parcel of our flu season, they mutate quickly. And they have to guess, the researchers and producers have to guess which ones are going to be part of the next season's cocktails, and they don't always guess right. So for what it is prepared for, it's generally batch 3 out of 4 or better. The problem is that there's always going to be a degree of guesswork. You don't have to worry about that with coronavirus. Coronaviruses are much more stable. They don't mutate nearly as often. So the fact that the coronavirus is not presenting us with a moving target is a big advantage.
Well, even if you're to say, flu vaccine is 50, 60% effective, 90% effective for coronavirus vaccine, that's extremely effective. Yeah.
If that holds out in the phase 3 trials, that's amazing. That is better results than anybody has been expecting to this point if that holds.
Right, because the implications of that is that we don't need to inoculate as much of the population in that case in order to reach herd immunity, right?
That's a topic that's gotten a little dicey of late. And again, because we're dealing with a very small sample size, I don't want to overpromise anything here. But the best guess is that in New York City, which is the city that has the highest infection rates writ large because of that big first wave exposure, that only 1 in 5 people have the resistance. And in the rest of the country, it's less than half that. Best guess is to get effective herd immunity. We need 60% resistance in all demographic clusters. So that would suggest we need about half of the population of the country to get inoculated, or a little bit more if we've got 90% effectiveness on the vaccine. If we only had half effectiveness on the vaccine, we would need everybody. So yes, we can have upwards of a third of the population who, for whatever reason, decide or don't get the vaccine if it's of this quality, and we're okay. But again, this doesn't happen by the first quarter. This doesn't happen by the third quarter. With this one, we could only begin mass inoculations in the third quarter, and you're really talking early 2022 for this to be over.
Okay, so we really need to have another vaccine.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah. We can't just be banking on Pfizer at this point, given, like you said, some of those trade-offs with the delivery method, cold storage, and some of those issues that are at play. Last time we had talked to you about what's going on with vaccine developments abroad and how, China had started inoculating their military with their own vaccine, Russians, the general public before fully testing. Have there been any breakthroughs or major announcements or collateral damage from doing that elsewhere in the world?
The Russians have been making new breakthroughs about every 2 weeks. Or I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Have been making big announcements every 2 weeks. It's very Russian. As soon as they hear that somebody has had some sort of breakthrough, the Russians issue a new press release saying exactly the same thing, but one-upping. So I would fully expect, for example, now that the Pfizer information is out, that the Russians will say that theirs has 95% effectiveness. There's absolutely no data to back up anything that the Russians have been saying to this point. I don't think that's going to change. The Chinese are doing phase 3 trials in 16 different countries. The Chinese have been fairly successful at rooting the virus out of their own country, which means they can't test the vaccine at home. So they're going to Brazil and the UAE and South Africa and a number of other countries that they're seeking better relations with and attempting to test it that way. Again, phase 3 is in progress. They haven't released any data. It's certainly not done. But the Chinese are, just like everybody else, ramping up mass production of their vaccine as if it were going to be successful. So it will definitely be part of the mix one way or the other.
And the Chinese are basically banking on just one vaccine at this point. They don't have multiple that they're all working on.
There's a bunch that are going on in the background, but there's really just that one that is going through phase 3 trials that everyone's focused on. The others are kind of like a backup plan, just in case for whatever reason this one's a disaster.
And you'd also said that China is reaching out to a number of countries, and I'm guessing it's these 16 different countries, probably either all or just a handful of them, and saying that they'll give them that vaccine ahead of others, including the U.S., in exchange for recognizing their territorial claims in the South China Sea. Has there been any movement on the geopolitical front? When you think about, hey, we'll give you this, you give us you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours kind of thing.
Countries are understandably unwilling to cut the deal before they actually know that if the vaccine is going to work. And the Chinese have been proven very sophomoric when it comes to trading geopolitical favors for things. There's a deep-seated arrogance in Chinese culture situated around the concept of the Middle Kingdom, how China is the center of humanity and always has been. I mean, it's not even remotely backed up by historical fact, but that's not the point. It's propaganda. And nobody wants to get caught up in that if they can avoid it. And when it comes to things like the Belt and Road, the Chinese have really misplayed and overplayed their hands. Every time that they've tried to sweep in and grab whatever the collateral was for some of these loans, the foreign countries have usually just nationalized the loan and repudiated the payments. So there is a very, very small move among the Chinese bureaucrats who realize that this is not working, but those are not the people making the decisions. So the Chinese are continuing to just barrel down as if they were the Trump campaign.
Well, speaking of which, I want to see if we can transition over to the elections. I'll just tee it up for you right there. What are your thoughts on the elections and the outcome so far?
Well, let's start with the punchline. Of the 20-odd cases that the Trump administration has filed in various courts alleging voter fraud, most of those have already been tossed. I mean, one of them was particularly weird. The only evidence that was presented was something that someone wrote on a Post-it note. So it was hearsay written down on a Post-it, and that was the entire basis of the case. And there were several of the cases that have been brought that actually had less evidence, and all of those were just summarily tossed out as soon as they were brought before judges. What is left looks like it's going to be small scale enough that it's not going to challenge the results in any state. So the Trump administration is going through the motions, but this is settled, if not certified. Certification usually takes 4 to 6 weeks. That process is only getting started. And so when somebody in the Trump campaign says that the election is not over, technically that's true, and that's fine. But I think we know how this is going to shake out. We're looking at electoral vote stack up that is very similar to what we had the last time, again, just flipped. So it's not like this is a huge surprise. Pros and cons of where we are. First, pros. This is the most people who have ever voted. And Biden got more votes than any other presidential candidate in history, and Donald Trump got the second most popular votes in history. So say what you will about Americans, you can't say that we don't care. Everybody showed up. But there's a downside here, in that both political parties are in a state of breakdown. The Republicans under Trump have basically melon-balled the business community, the fiscal voters, and the military community out of the Republican Party, and that shows in policy, and that shows in voting platforms, and that shows in voting trends, and in the demographics that have popped up from exit polls. But it's not like the Democrats are in a better position. They've lost the unions completely. The unions basically shifted wholesale over to the Trump administration. Over a third of the Hispanic vote voted for Trump, especially in Texas. In fact, the only reason that Trump captured Texas was because of the Hispanic vote. The laws, the norms that we've become used to have been completely tossed out. And even in this election, with the media 100% behind the Democrats, and the Democrats having succeeded in raising more funds than ever in history, and complete support from Hollywood, we didn't get a wave. Biden barely eked it out. He only beat Trump in the popular vote by about 2%. It's not a landslide in the Electoral College. The Republicans were able to hang on to the Senate, and the Republicans actually gained seats in the House. And if the Democratic coalition under these circumstances, with a heretofore unprecedentedly controversial and unpopular president, if that's the best that they can get, this party's done in its current form. Now, this is the 7th time the American political parties have reshuffled. It's normal. It reflects society and technology and geopolitical involvements. And because of the end of the Cold War and the rise of the digital revolution, we have been edging this direction in some time. But it takes 8 to 12 years, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, in order to have these political coalitions shake out into new formations that are a little bit more relevant for today's political system. We are in year 5 right now. So we should plan on at least the next 4 years of being more of the same. And after that point, we are going to look back at today's Democratic and Republican coalitions and wonder why those factions were ever able to hold together in the first place. And that's normal, and we'll get through it. But wow, is it going to be awkward from here to there.
So this isn't unusual. This is a common process. Like you said, it happens every 8 years. Did I get that right? You said...
It takes 8 to 12 years for the process to shake out the transition. It happens every generation or two. So the last big one for us happened in the aftermath of the Roaring '20s with the Great Depression and World War II. Back then, the business community used to be Democrats and African Americans used to all be Republicans. So, this isn't odd. It just feels weird.
Now, you had mentioned that we saw a massive turnout, and clearly that is the case. We can look back and see. Like you said, I mean, Biden won more votes than any other president in history, which is interesting because one of the things that people on the right say is, how is it that someone that even had signs and slogans which were settle for Biden? I mean, there was not a lot of enthusiasm behind Joe Biden, and his rallies were not very well attended as far as I understand. And yet at the same time, he has this massive turnout. That's one of the critiques is how that there's something weird going on. What would you say to that?
Well, Biden is in the latter half of his 8th decade. He was never going to energize the youth. He is a commensurate broker and compromiser, not an ideologue. So he was never going to kind of set the fringe on fire in the way that somebody like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren could. But if you were an American political moderate or a disaffected conservative, for example, of those 3 factions that Trump has driven away, business voters, military voters, fiscal voters, he was a lifeline. Best guess from the exit polls, polls these days, take this for what it is. About half of the people who voted for Trump loved Trump, voted for Trump. But about 3/4 of the people who voted for Biden voted against Trump. That was their primary motivator.
Yeah.
So it's, we can always do a coulda, woulda, shoulda, but I think the Democrats would have done better if they hadn't accused everyone of being racist. And I think the Republicans could have been better if they had toned down the racial language. But it was just as important for both sides to drum up their base as it was to grab the moderates. Now, for moderates like me in the middle, at the end of this, I just wanted a shower. And I'm just glad it's over. I am really looking forward to how the parties reshape over the next 4 years. And that is something that the bases on the left and the right, I'm sure, are terrified of, because it means not all the factions are going to make it through.
Well, and it means that their statistics and who they've been relying on in years, decades past is not going to work going forward, right? Now they've got to put in some hard work, roll up those sleeves, and figure out a new way to reach new voters.
Yeah, it's our first political rearrangement of the modern era, certainly the first of the digital revolution. And the media as an institution has broadly failed the public when it comes to politics. So we know that the broadcasting isn't working. And we know that social media requires a different social contract with the population. This is all getting shaken out at the same time. So of course we're seeing political instability.
Now, Peter, I got to ask you about something that I think is on the minds of a lot of different Americans and probably even those who live outside America. That's that America's going down. You look at the state of the election process and the uncertainty and the chaos, the civil unrest that we saw this year, the racial tension. You look at all these things and you think, gosh, America's in a really bad place, and it's probably going to be overtaken by China or some other country here pretty soon. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I'm not worried about that at all. For one, American politics are always loud and messy. You argue the most with your family. We now have social media where we don't have any good regulatory structure for it. So, of course, we're giving voice to people who normally are so far out on the fringes to be irrelevant. All of a sudden, they're dominating the conversation, and that's what we're hearing day in, day out. So take that for what it is. It's noise. And when you looked at the voting information that we saw from this round, honestly, the number of people who were foaming at the mouth pro-Biden or pro-Trump was a relatively small population, maybe larger than before. We might be up to 15% total for the two sides, but still the vast middle is still very middle. So I'm not worried about that. Number two, in part because we haven't figured out what we're going to do with social media. It has allowed countries on the outside to poke at us however they want. And so the Chinese and the Russians in particular have been very, very active. Now, not as active in this election as I thought it was going to be. One of the things that the Trump administration did in the few weeks before the election is they went and they hacked the hackers pretty aggressively, which honestly I thought was fantastic. So the Russian bot farm, for example, had a lot of server failures because of things that the U.S. government was doing, which, more, please. And then third, one of the big things to keep in mind, one of the reasons why a lot of countries and people think that the United States is in decline is we're withdrawing from the world. We're no longer dictating how the world works. And I can totally see why that would anger and make some people despondent. However, what most people forget is the US created the global order in order to buy an alliance to fight the Cold War. And the Cold War's been over for 30 years. So we basically created a global system of safety and enabled global trade to occur without military escort for the first time in history. And that is what enabled Europe to reunify. That is what generated the panda boom in China. If the United States just steps back, all of the gains in globalization that we have seen since 1946 goes into screaming reverse because everyone agrees they want the trade, but everybody wants to be in charge of that trade. And if the United States is not basically forcing everyone to be on the same side and removing military pressure from commerce, then military pressure goes back into commerce and you can no longer have global exchange. You can have maybe regional exchange if you have a regional superpower who can impose their will on their neighborhood, but they can't trade with the next major power over. So the best case outcome of this is you get a European trade network, you get an East Asian trade network, but even that is more than enough to destroy the European and the Chinese systems because they don't have the demographics to purchase their own goods. They have to export them to the wider world, and they can only do that with the United States. And even that assumes that the Japanese and the Chinese agree to just get along. And I don't think hope for that is very high.
So in your mind, the United States still holds a lot of the levers here.
It's not that we're holding the levers. We could if we wanted to. It's that we just don't care anymore. And making the world work requires active participation and leadership from a country that has global reach. And there is no one but the United States that can even theoretically do that. And so if we're not interested, it doesn't happen.
And one of the things that you point out in your books and in your work is that the United States is the least involved. It's one of the most isolated economies in the global system. And so in a world where there's a lot of chaos over supply disruptions or trade, it doesn't affect America that much because of all the internal economic activity that takes place either within the U.S. itself or between Canada and Mexico and the U.S. So that's one major feature that separates the U.S. from other places around the world.
Yeah, one thing that I'm a Gen X, one of the 47, that really bothers me is that I've got to look at the baby boomers, the largest generation we've ever had, and I've got to be thankful because they did something that no other generation of baby boomers anywhere else in the world did. They had kids, which means I have to look below me to the millennials as the great saviors of our system. The boomers are the investors and the producers. The millennials are the new parents and they are the consumers. And you need a balance of those things in order to make a modern system work. And because of the boomers' collective decision to have children, we have that. We're one of only a handful of places that have that. And we have more young people than all the other developed countries in the world put together. That is something that is going to keep the United States chugging along for decades. And it means that a lot of these economic and strategic problems that the rest of the world is going to be struggling with just aren't an issue here, or at least are not an issue here for the next 20 years.
Well, unfortunately, it appears that the millennials are not having kids at the same rate that the boomers were. So maybe that's a conversation for another couple decades from now.
Well,
But
one of the things we've seen about the millennials is because of the whole extended adolescence thing, which is a real statistically proven thing, a lot of the big life decisions have been put off, but they haven't opted for a different direction. So, for example, the average age of home ownership in the United States, first-time home ownership, is 32. Well, the average millennial is 31 this year, and we are already seeing home sales surge even in the pandemic. And while today millennials have fewer kids than the generations that came before, they're still having them, and they're having them at almost the same rate. They're just not getting married as soon. So most of the data points to the millennials not being oddballs in the way that we portrayed them. And they're not living in basements anymore. They have lives. They have careers.
yeah, it's interesting you say that. Ralph McLaughlin, he's a housing expert we've had on our show a number of times. He's talked about how the millennial generation is going to be a multi-decade tailwind for the housing market. And it appears, like you're saying, average millennial age is 31 right now, and average home buying age is 32, if I got the correct. So
Yes.
We're just in the beginning stage of perhaps that tailwind keeping the real estate market buoyant for some time.
No, I agree with all that. Don't get too excited because it will still look different, but it's not necessarily because of the millennials, but more because of other evolutions that are going on. So one of the things that we saw with the millennials is at first they wanted the big coastal urban enclave experience. Well, that's great when you're in your 20s, but when you start to have kids and get settled down and you want a home, you can't do that in New York. So you move out. Because of coronavirus, nobody wants to live where they're dependent on mass transit. So you're moving out. And with the boomers moving into retirement, nobody wants to shovel snow. So they're moving out. So we're seeing this huge population relocation. We're just at the leading edge of it now, going to the south, the west, and the southwest, out of the core urban centers, out of the normal millennial enclaves or the big centers of foreign investment, places like Seattle or Santa Monica or Chicago or Miami or New York, moving out of all of those into places that are in the south, the west, and the southwest. And that is going to reshape a lot. And yes, the millennials are in the thick of it, but it's not just the millennials. We're seeing the biggest internal movements that we have seen in this country since we built the interstate system in the 50s. And it's got legs.
So in sum, given what we discussed today, we can't just bank on the Pfizer vaccine. We need probably see multiple vaccines in tandem. Otherwise, we're going to be talking a year from now before Pfizer would be released to the wider public. So need multiple vaccines. Trump is unlikely to change the state of the outcome currently with the 270 or more electoral votes towards Biden. And when it comes down to, let's say, United States future, you're not down on the dumps for the U.S., even when we look around at all the uncertainty and the chaos. This is part of the social media world that we live in. And there is still a somewhat bright future, demographically speaking, for the United States. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we close today's interview?
I would just add that I've said a few things in this interview that perhaps might not be interpreted as overly pro-Trump, but I do want to underline something that Trump did that was absolutely right on, and that was forcibly renegotiating a handful of trade deals. The deals that the Trump administration has ratified with Korea, Japan, Mexico, and Canada, those 4 deals are almost the majority of the American trade portfolio, and especially if we're looking at a slimming down of the relationship with China, those are 4 of the 5 countries that you absolutely want to bring into the family. The 5th being the United Kingdom, which is, of course, snarled up in all things Brexit. But the hard work for the United States of maintaining any sort of international economic exposure is done. The treaties have been signed, they've been ratified, they've been implemented. So the next president can work from that base and focus on some things at home. Now, as a foreign policy guy, that kind of annoys me because I would like to see the United States be a lot more active around the world. But people who believe my way have lost the last 7 elections, so I'm not taking it personal.
Well, for any of you listening right now, if you're not familiar with Peter Zeihan's work, I would highly encourage you to go to Zeihan.com. Again, that's spelled Zeihan.com. And you can also get acquainted with his newsletter, sign up there, and also a number of his different books, which we've spoken with Peter on our show in the past. Disunited Nations being his most recent one, The Absent Superpower, and The Accidental Superpower, all of which are must-reads. Peter, always a pleasure having you on our show. We look forward to speaking with you again.
The Financial Sense News Hour is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the News Hour each involve their own unique risk factors, which are not discussed on the show. Responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the Financial Sense staff and do not take into account listener suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Financial Sense News Hour and its parent company shall not be liable for any financial losses that result from investing in any companies mentioned in Financial Sense or arising out of the use of any material on the News Hour. Be advised that you invest at your own risk.